This screencast is going to focus on the Harlem Renaissance, which is we're going to talk in a little bit more specific detail about in a few moments here, but I want to just start by doing a little bit of review and important facts about where African Americans were kind of immediately following World War I and some of the struggles they encountered. Then we'll get into the Harlem Renaissance movement specifically. So kind of remember, during the World War I unit, we focused on the Great Migration, which is when hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South to more urban cities in the North, basically hoping to find jobs and a better life altogether. So when this move occurred, this doesn't necessarily mean that northern cities are super welcoming of this new kind of influx of African Americans moving in. Tensions are still existing within the cities. But this move did occur, and the Harlem Renaissance is going to be affected by this move, so we'll talk about that in a moment here. Just a quote here from a story written by Zora Neale Hurston. You don't have to memorize this quote, but she kind of describes this Great Migration. Some said goodbye cheerfully, others fearfully, with terrors of unknown dangers in their mouths, other in their eagerness for distance and nothing. The daybreak found them gone, the wind said north. Now, as a response to just continuous racial tension, both in the South and cities in the North, some African American leaders are going to take on roles of leadership to create kind of civil rights organizations. And one of the most prominent organizations is created actually a few years before this, but becomes more prominent during this time. This is going to be the NAACP. So W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the founding members of the NAACP, which the acronym stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is going to urge African Americans to protest and stand up against racial violence in the United States. And they do this through a variety of ways. They have lawyers represent African Americans in certain cases. They will organize parades as a form of protest, much like NAACP did, or NWP during our women's suffrage movement. They will lobby to Congress for anti-lynching laws. And, this is a representative of a more vocal movement within African American their rights and their interests. Okay, and so African Americans are starting to stand up for themselves within the NAACP, and this is still a very prominent civil rights organization today. There's going to be another group that emerges during this time, and this group is going to be called the UNIA, which stands for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They're going to take a little bit of a different approach to African American rights. The organization was founded by a man named Marcus Garvey. His name is written on the screen. And he was a black man, but he was actually an immigrant from Jamaica. And his goal and approach to this is a bit more radical than the NAACP message was. And he kind of arouses this mentality and this message of black pride in the United States. He is basically going to start this movement where he encourages, via his organization, he encourages his followers and his supporters to join together and return to Africa. He doesn't want to create this kind of blended interracial harmony in the United States. He actually wants to emphasize a separate black society by, African Americans removing themselves from the equation and reestablishing themselves in what he considered their homeland of Africa. Okay, so kind of not a message of unity, but more really further division, and an emphasis on black pride. Now, of course, when people would return to Africa, if they were to do this and follow in his response or in his encouragement, Africa is being colonized by, European countries. They'd have to overthrow European oppressors and kind of take control of that continent again. Granted, African Americans hadn't really been a part of true African culture, or at least within Africa, in their lifetimes, at least not most of them. So while this movement was, big in certain sectors, it never really gets off to a full start. He is eventually going to lose support because he is going to be eventually convicted of mail fraud and sent to jail. And even though the group really didn't leave a footprint like the NAACP obviously did, it still does awaken this sense of economic independence, reverence for African culture, black pride, a more radical approach to civil rights that other groups are going to carry on in his place. And we'll talk more about that in the Civil Rights Movement unit. Okay, the Harlem Renaissance. Many African Americans who migrated north ended up settling in Harlem, which was a neighborhood kind of in the upper side of Manhattan, which is New York City. So a neighborhood in New York City. Within the 1920s, Harlem will become the world's largest black urban community. It's in many cases considered the black capital of America at this time. Now, Harlem had its share of, poverty, unemployment, overcrowding, urban problems, but within this neighborhood, there's going to be a movement that flourishes within some of the negative sides of the urban neighborhood, and this is going to refer to the Harlem Renaissance. So, the Harlem Renaissance was a literary and artistic movement that celebrated African American culture, and it is going to stem out of the neighborhood of Harlem, New York. So it's kind of this, the beauty of the movement is really emphasized because of how bad things kind of were in urban areas in New York for blacks. So we're going to look at some of the different aspects of this movement. We'll start with the written aspect. So more than anything, the Harlem Renaissance was a literary movement. So written expression was the focal point. It was a movement led by well-educated, middle-class, mostly African Americans who kind of expressed pride in their culture and in their experience. So they would have different stories or different types of writings that would emphasize the African American experience of blacks during this time in history. So two examples of writers, Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who we heard from earlier. Langston Hughes was probably the movement's best most known poet. Many of his poems just kind of describe the experience of the working class African Americans during this time in history. And poetry's big because it's kind of set to the tempo of jazz and jazz beats, which is also going to be a prominent aspect of this time. And Zora Neale Hurston wrote short stories and folklore, and she was also a writer. Now, performers, and in this case, really actors, people in theater. It was not common for African Americans to participate in, theater or the performing arts, but in this case, we're going to see one Mr. Paul Robeson be one of the first dramatic actors who was an African American during this time, and he is going to have a performance in a Shakespearean play, Othello, which gets a lot of national recognition. So he was very successful in his acting career. And then, of course, there's jazz. Now, we, being loyal Louisianians, know that jazz was born in New Orleans and nowhere else. So don't let anyone from Missouri tell you otherwise. Jazz is born in New Orleans. And jazz music, is a blend of certain instruments and kind of blues and ragtime, and it was just this very new, inventive sound. One of the most famous jazz musicians was Joe Oliver, and he had a Creole jazz band down in New Orleans, and eventually they moved to the cities in the urban north, bringing their jazz music with them. And they became very popular in many nightclubs and speakeasies around the north. A young trumpet player or trumpeter, Louis Armstrong, from New Orleans, of course he's well known, is eventually going to join Oliver's group, and his talent really rockets him to stardom. He becomes very, very famous with his music. He's very famous for his scat, which is kind of this type of singing. He basically would sing like sounds instead of words. We'll play some examples of this in class, maybe Tuesday. But he became one of the most influential jazz artists in history, and I think we all know the airport in New Orleans is named after him. So jazz music really becomes a really key part of the era and the movement. And jazz music is high in demand during the 20s. This is what people want to dance to. This is what they want to experience when they attend and go to speakeasies. So jazz musicians will perform. For example, Duke Ellington. He is going to become a jazz pianist and composer who leads an orchestra, a jazz band at the Cotton Club, which is one of the more famous speakeasies. And then Bessie Smith is an example of a female blues singer during this time. Now, the Harlem Renaissance is going to flourish, and African American culture will continue to grow in the United States. What is not going to continue to grow is the economy, because we are headed into the era known as the Great Depression, and we're going to pick up with how the economy came to a halt and then a crash in our Chapter 19 notes next week. So I know this is long. Write down any questions you have. You have until Thursday to view this, and let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you'll have a great weekend.